Okay, I couldn't find a recording that's in the public domain, so I gotta be careful with how much I quote from any one recording. But I do, of course, recommend that everyone go listen to the original version of this amazing piece. This is the Ouverture to Tannhäuser, the opera by Wagner. And it's a piece that I've wanted to look into forever, especially for what happens right after this opening chorale, which is an awesome build-up with pretty interesting harmony. So we'll get to try to see how that works in a moment. In the meantime, the chorale itself is fairly simple. So I just recorded this piano reduction by Liszt, and as you saw, I labeled the harmony with the Roman numerals. It's mainly diatonic in E major, it modulates to B major at the end, and it has a couple of forays into G sharp and C sharp minor. But other than that, it's fairly straightforward. On the other hand, it's not completely basic, so there are some chords and some harmonic turns that would not really be standard in the most basic tonal plan. So the chord of 6 in first inversion appears all over the place in the piece. That's a chord that's common, it's 6-6, but it usually happens when the bass remains on the tonic note after a chord of tonic. That's how you get a 6 in first inversion. In this case, we have 6-6 all over the place without the context of a pedal point. So there's a couple of retrogressions, so that chord of 6 itself several times goes to the chord of tonic instead of moving forward on toward the dominant. And here we have a 4 that's followed by tonic again. So same thing, instead of moving towards the dominant, there's a retrogression back to tonic. Now, when you look at that chord of 6-6 that I was pointing out before, it's right in between two chords of 1-6, so in a way it's just a prolongation of that chord of 1-6. It's kind of a harmonic neighbor chord prolonging that 1-6. Another very clear passing chord is that 1-6 I was pointing out before. That's just clearly a motion between the 4 and the 2 in the bass. And in that same sense, when we have this figure, melodically this clearly is just passing tones from the G sharp to the C sharp. So harmonically what happens is almost kind of a series of passing chords just harmonizing a melodic ornament of that scale. And look at this, when we remove all those harmonies that are mainly the result of contrapuntal motion, then the progression at the structural level is 1 going to 6, going to 4, going to 2, going to a dominant of the dominant, and then to dominant. So it's the paradigmatic progression through the diatonic scale. The second phrase doesn't actually need much of that. It's much more straightforward progression through diatonic chords and applied dominants. And that second phrase, which ends in the key of the dominant, closes the first opening statement of the chorale. What will happen next is an amazing build-up, crescendo through the strings first, then joined by more and more orchestra until we have a huge climactic tutti statement of the chorale. So that's what we're going to look into in more detail. This is first sight analysis with the overture to Wagner's Tannhäuser. So we had ended in the key of B major, the key of the dominant on a 1, that then acquires a 7th. This becomes a dominant of E, and it may be that we're modulating back to E, the key of a piece, or we're simply doing an emphasis to 4. We'll see what happens later. In any case, it does resolve to E, but it's a chord of E minor. So either way, we're going to the minor mode. So that's E minor. Then we have a chord of B minor in first inversion. The bass is on the D, so there is a hand crossing. The left hand is playing above the right hand here. This is consistent with the score. The cellos have that melody that's in the left hand. But the point is that the bass is now in the right hand in this transcription. So right here we have the chord of B minor in first inversion. So That emphasis to E was not a modulation. We changed to B minor, but we didn't modulate back to E. So that was 4 followed by 1, 6, minor 1 in first inversion. And then we have F sharp major, which is the dominant. So certainly we're still in B minor. And now we would be expecting to resolve back to B. Oh, but we get this chord of D major. So that's interesting, that A sharp, which was the leading tone, moved not to tonic but moved down. It's a beautiful progression, but it's certainly a deceptive resolution of that dominant. And it's not just a regular deceptive cadence. So B minor would have been the deceptive cadence in D, but here we have it backwards. We're resolving a dominant of B onto D, so it's not exactly a deceptive cadence. What is it instead? Well, that resolution chord is a major chord, so we could say this is an applied dominant. So D major would be the dominant of G. So we could say we are in fact going to the normal deceptive cadence in B, which would be G, and we're mediating that with its own applied dominant. That is a fairly normal progression of a chord of dominant going through the dominant of 6 onto 6 as a mediated deceptive cadence. The thing is that in general with deceptive cadences we're talking about dominant in root position, and here we have a chord of dominant in second inversion. And sure, in the 19th century the whole thing with inversions and with the position of the bass is a little relaxed, but still thinking that that D is an applied dominant to something that's coming later would make sense theoretically, but here I'm hearing that chord of D truly as a resolution of a previous chord. I don't perceive that chord to be a surprise or a replacement of a dominant with another dominant, right? I think that has to do with this interval that's resolving inwards, so that A sharp is actually behaving as a B flat that points down to A, and that creates that interval with the C sharp, the diminished seventh, and that's where we're getting that satisfying resolution. C sharp and B flat do want to resolve to that open fifth. And that diminished seventh interval would be the characteristic interval of a fully diminished chord, a 7-7, which has the C sharp and the B flat, and would normally have an E and a G. The C sharp and the B flat point to D and A. The other two notes would be the ones pointing to F sharp, to the third of the chord. In this case, it's like we're replacing those notes by their anticipated resolution. So this is kind of similar to the altered 5 that we've encountered in most of our videos ever since the analysis of Mozart's Fantasia. So that 5, where instead of having the second degree, we have the third degree that anticipates already one of the notes of the resolution. In fact, that same note, the third of a chord. In this case, we're doing that not on a chord of 5, but on a chord of 7. We haven't seen this before. It's not like altered 5, which is a relatively normal construction, but it's the same principle, but on the chord of 7. We would have to call this altered 7. We could have just resolved back to B, and that would be okay, it would be normal. We can just continue the sequence there. But this special inflection smooths over the transition in the sequence, and it's just a beautiful progression. Either way, we're now in D major, so we're resolved to a chord of D major. In fact, it's interesting to notice that the chord of 7-7 with the diminished seventh would be the 7-7 of D minor. The fact that we're resolving to major tells the ear that this is a dominant. So it's kind of like it was a 7 of 5 going to a 5. And of course, in this case, an altered 7 of 5 going to a 5. And in fact, look at how this chord of D major also acquires the seventh, and what appears to be an exact sequence. So let's see, we would resolve that to G minor, but that is actually 4 because we're now in D minor, 1 in first inversion, and then we go to its dominant, so that's correct, the chord of A major. And again, this chord, instead of resolving to D, would resolve as an altered 7, in this case to F. And that is what happens. So the sequence is the same. And now we have that chord of F, which also acquires the seventh. And there is the resolution in B flat minor, which does go to the chord of F minor. Same as before, except that the voicing is changing, the orchestration is getting richer, and now the bass is doubled. We're expecting the dominant, yes, this is the dominant of F, C major, and if the phrase did what it had done before, then we would resolve that C major onto the chord of A flat major. We have instead a chord of D sharp diminished with a seventh in first inversion. So this is interesting and a little bit challenging because being a diminished chord, fully diminished chord, we don't really know what the root is. It is spelled as D sharp diminished, but in this chromatic context and tonal vagrancy context, it may be behaving as an F sharp diminished, or as an A diminished, or even as a C diminished, just changing the spelling. So let me see what it sounds like. Where does it want to go? Is there any clear tendency that may help us label it? To me, it is very clear that this note wants to go back up to E. I don't know if that's because I've heard the B's and that's what does happen later, but I think it's kind of undeniable that this top note in the chord wants to go up. So whatever the chord we're pointing to is, it will have that E. That may be the chord of E itself, and in fact, yeah, that sounds like a perfectly normal resolution. It may be a chord of A with that E as a fifth, but that doesn't sound nearly as convincing, right? I don't think this chord is functioning as an emphasis to A. And then that E could also be part of the chord of C. And yeah, maybe it sounds like a convincing resolution of it. To my ears, this is much rather an emphasis to E. And when you look ahead, you see that B coming up, which is the note of the dominant of E, and that confirms the direction towards E. It's almost as if that C is a suspension of that B, and it creates that 7 of E that will become a full-blown 5 of E. Now I know what you're thinking. In addition to that B, there's also the F natural in the bass. So this won't really be the chord of 5 of E, unless you'd say it's the chord of 5 with the fifth lowered, F natural instead of F sharp. That doesn't quite fully destroy the argument. A chord of dominant with the lowered fifth gives you a French chord, the French augmented sixth. So we have the augmented sixth there with the D sharp and the F, both a semitone away from E. So this is the double leading tone, which makes even more of an emphasis to E. The only thing is that it sets it up as a dominant. So that E will be the dominant. So at this point, this progression is in A. And we're making an emphasis to the dominant through the French. Then that resolves onto the dominant. And in fact, that dominant does resolve to A minor. So we came from before making an emphasis to E through the 7 of E. But then that becomes 7 of 5 in A. That gives way to the French and the final cadence. And then that A minor behaves as 4 because we're going back to E. When we have that chord of C major followed by B major, this is clearly 6 and 5 in E. So that A minor resolution chord is a pivot chord that's 4 in E. And now we're back on B as a dominant. And well, I actually checked this ahead of time. What follows is a repetition of the same sequence with the alter 7s and so on, all the way to that French and that dominant in A. And it has that same suspension before the resolution to A, although this time it resolves to C sharp, so the resolution is to A major, not minor, as it was before. Then the music proceeds through a couple of passing tones into this chord at the end of measure. That then goes to this, where the G sharp is clearly another suspension. The chord is fully realized with the F sharp. And there is a chord of B7, dominant of the original key of E. So at some point we went back to E. The chord before, which is F sharp, C sharp, A in the bass, this is 2-6. And that resolution on A, as tonic, is 4 in E major. The passing tones, in fact, make up a 5/7 of 2, with the C sharp and the E sharp and the B, although the bass is staying on that A as a pedal point. In any case, we're back in E, preparing for the final rush with that huge crescendo and the triplets, with a simpler progression where each chord takes up a full measure. But the progression is not fully diatonic in E. We have that emphasis on B with the A sharp over there. It's like once we reach the B, that chord of B, we have a full progression in B, with 6 as a predominant chord, and then F sharp as a dominant to E. And then that resolves into B7 as the final dominant for the final re-entrance of the chorale.